Thanks for the opportunity to be a part of this year's Crops TV program. I'm Denise Schwab, Extension Beef Specialist for Northeast Iowa, and my partner today is Erica Lundy, the Beef Specialist for Southwest Iowa. And we're going to talk about summer annuals and incorporating summer annuals into the rotation to grow additional feed. There are a number of advantages for growing annuals, and it kind of depends where you're coming at. From our perspective with cattle, we're really looking at how do we extend that grazing season and produce high quality forages on some of those crop acres. If we're thinking about it from an environmental standpoint, we look down here at water infiltration, soil compaction, some soil health, those benefits. And from a cropping standpoint, incorporating annuals into your rotation can also help first to just break up that traditional corn soy rotation, but also in terms of reducing weed pressure. So regardless of which of these are the most important to you, there are a number of benefits to using annual forages. I think Erica put this slide together, but it does a nice job of explaining why we would look at annual forages. From a Coolseason pasture standpoint, you can see we have our optimum and maximum growth probably from about early mid-April, depending on what part of Iowa you live in, out to that mid-June timeframe when we start to get warm. And then we have a second really nice flush of growth here in the fall. But throughout the middle part of the summer, from a Coolseason pasture standpoint, we see very little growth due to heat and dryness. And that's what we call our summer slump. What we look at with our cover crops is we would look at planting those here in that early fall timeframe so that we can get grazing out here in early winter and again early in the spring before our cool season grasses start to grow. Where our warm season annuals have a big benefit is by the fact that we can be seeding them here in May and June after the traditional corn and soybean planting season, giving them 45 to 50 days of growth and be able to graze them here in the midsummer when our normal cool season pasture has a summer slump. So a huge benefit there. What we're kind of trying to encourage our producers to think about is a multiple year program where we plant our winter annuals, our cool season annuals here with a shorter grain crop. So maybe following corn silage or seed corn or an early soybean, or that we would seed those earlier, graze them in the winter and early spring, follow that with our warm season annuals for our summer grazing, early fall grazing, follow again with a winter annual, and then go back into our normal corn soy rotation. So oftentimes with our annual crops, we're pushing the limits both on the fall and on the spring, but by going with a rotation like this, we can kind of get the best of all of those. So where to get started? Obviously, the first question is kind of addressing what are the objectives or goals for why you would want to incorporate annuals. And to me, that first question then is, are we going to graze that or are we planning to mechanically harvest? Because that makes a big difference in terms of the species that we're going to select in the following decisions. There are some grazing issues with some of our warm season annuals, and we'll address those as we go through. Obviously, if we're going to graze, water and fences are important. But I also put in here this other fields. It's nice if the annual fields are adjacent or easily accessible from our traditional pasture. So thinking about the location. Then we get into the process of species selection, as well as looking at feed quality and quantity as we're looking at species. Thinking about species selection, obviously we want to look for species that are adapted to our growing season, that we know will grow well in our Iowa environment and climate. Then what's the ease of accessing that seed? How hard is it to plant or harvest? Can we use our traditional either drills or planters to be able to utilize this? The same with the mechanical harvesting of forages. Our next question is looking at feed quality for whatever livestock we're raising, whether that be beef or dairy cattle, sheep, or other species. And then again, how does it fit into our grazing objectives? So I'm going to start looking at some of the different species, and that's what I want to spend most of my time on today. The first we'd say look at our spring cereals planted in the spring. So things like oats, barley, spring wheat, spring triticale, all those species that we're used to growing in the cool season of the spring. We can get fairly decent yields with a good dense stand and get grazing in 4 to 5 weeks. Start grazing when those plants are about 8 to 10 inches. We'll probably only get 1, maybe 2 grazings off it. But remember, these are spring cereals, so they are what we would call our cool seasons. We need to get those utilized before we start to hit that warm weather in about July. We can also use those same spring cereals, but use an out of season use. So plant them in the summer or fall. And so this kind of gets into some of our traditional cover crops when we think about oats and spring wheat, spring triticale, seeded in the fall. We can get decent stands, but again, getting it seeded early, getting good seed soil contact, and a good rainfall after that, kind of in that August time frame, is what we need to get enough growth. We probably, again, need about 40, 45, 50 days to get a sizable growth to make it worthwhile grazing in the fall. And they're not winter hardy, so they're going to die off in the winter. That's a plus and a minus. From a grazing standpoint, though, we need to realize it's critical we seed early so that we can get enough fall growth to make it worthwhile grazing. Now, I mentioned cereal rye is probably our most common cover crop, as well as cool season annuals to get a lot of forage. We also can use annual and perennial ryegrass. We really want to point out these are not the same species as cereal rye. They're very different species. They just have a little bit of the same rye in their title. They're cool seasons. They grow, they emerge very quickly. They grow very rapidly. Yields can be adequate with plenty of nitrogen fertilizer. But again, they do not tolerate hot summer weather. So again, something we would seed early in the spring and try to get some grazing off of it. I'll switch now and talk about winter cereals planted in the fall. So this is our traditional cover crops. And again, to learn more about the traditional cover crops, cool seasons, Erica has done another cover crops TV program that looks specifically at cover crops and winter cereals. So I'm going to go through this really quickly. But our winter cereals like winter cereal rye, winter triticale, give us some grazing in the winter, but again, more grazing in the spring, adequate yields, do a good job of providing high quality and usually adequate tonnage with some challenges. But this is where we'd say, think about our traditional cover crops. The same thing, we can plant winter cereals out of season. So we plant them in the spring. Likely, they're not going to get adequate cold exposure to produce a seed head. So that will keep them more vegetative for a longer period of time. But remember, they also are cool season. So again, we're looking at trying to utilize them before we hit the heat of summer. With that, then I'm going to switch gears and go to some of our warm season annuals. And so the first one I want to talk about is Sedan Grass. It's the grassiest of our sorghum family. We're going to have 3 members of the sorghum family I'll talk about. These are true warm season annuals, so they do like it warm. We typically would plant these mid-late May into probably early July. And again, drill or broadcast seed to get the best stands. About 50 days, and we'll be able to be out grazing it. Produce maybe 2 or 3 growth cycles through the year, depending on how late we let it grow into the fall. Sedan grass is great from a grazing standpoint. It works well in a silage or a green chop type situation. Probably works well in baleage. None of our sorghum family work well for hay, for dry hay. Sedan grass is the best of the 3 options, but it's not a good option. It tends to have a stem that's maybe the size of my finger or thumb, and it just takes a long time to get that to dry down. So from a Sedan grass or the sorghum family, we would suggest not considering a dry hay option. But Sedan grass is more of the grassy part of that family. You're going to see this repeated for those of us that are horse people. Sedan grass and the whole sorghum family is not acceptable for horses. They just can't tolerate these grasses. The second entity of the sorghum family is the sorghum Sedan Grass hybrid. So this is a cross between a sorghum and a Sedan Grass variety. We probably see more variation within this category because it varies depending on the parent species or the parent hybrids that go into this crossbred system. So sometimes they look more like a big tall forage sorghum. Sometimes they're going to look more like the Sedan Grass. So it just depends on the parentage in this hybrid. Again, warm season, plant mid-May to early July. You see drills somewhere in that 25 pound per acre, broadcast around 30. Grazable forage somewhere around 50 days. Works great from a grazing standpoint, from a fresh cut forage or a green chop program. Works great for silage. Here we definitely would not recommend using this for hay. That stem is just too big and too coarse to be able to dry it down unless you have a couple weeks to let it lay, and even then it's questionable. Because this is a hybrid, it's going to produce more grazable tonnage than our Sedan Grass is, but it is a multiple cutting. So we can go out there and get some regrowth after each grazing. One of the things on all the sorghum family, the Sedan Grass, the sorghum Sedan hybrid, and the sorghum, is if we're grazing this, we really recommend that it be a rotational system. Again, you have a lot of plant mass out there. So from a grazing standpoint, we can get a lot of wastage from cattle grazing it if we allow them to have full access. So we suggest some type of a rotation if we're grazing these. And again, not acceptable to horses. The third in the family then is the true forage sorghum. This is the big cut, the big tall forage sorghum. It is a single cut. So we need to realize that if we're putting forage sorghum out, it's either going to be probably used as green chop or stored as silage. Probably doesn't fit very well from a grazing standpoint, just because it's a single cutting, a lot of total green mass out there, and we'd see a lot of forage waste if we're going to try to graze that. We do see a significant amount of variation within this species, again, both in yield and in grain quantity, as well as we're seeing some brown midrib forage sorghums, which is going to increase digestibility and fits very well into a silage program. This is our highest producing forage sorghum or sorghum family, somewhere in that 20 to 25 ton an acre corn silage. So it's probably going to be handled very similar to our traditional corn silage. And again, not for horses. Part of the reason it's not for horses, and one of the challenges with the whole sorghum family, is the fact that it produces hydrocyanic acid, which is also called prussic acid or prussic acid poisoning, and can affect animals from a standpoint of their ability to transport oxygen through the blood system. Our Sedan Grass tends to be the lowest risk. Our hybrid in the middle, and our forage and grain sorghums are the highest risk when it comes to prussic acid poisoning. Typically, this hydrocyanic acid or prussic acid tends to concentrate in the lower part of the stem and in the new fresh growth after it's been harvested or grazed and starts to regrow. So we always use this rule of thumb: don't graze any of the sorghums or sorghum sedans until they're roughly 2 to 2.5 feet tall, and try not to graze them shorter than probably about a foot. So we want to make sure we have plenty of leaf tissue that does not have the high concentration of prussic acid at the time we're grazing it. The other thing we want to say is be extremely cautious after any insult or injury to the plant. So anything like following a hailstorm, or after that first fall light frost, or again, as that's starting to regrow after grazing, that's when we tend to see the highest levels of prussic acid in the plant and the highest risk for injury to animals. The good thing about prussic acid is that as that product is stored for hay or silage, it tends to dissipate out of the stored feed. So it is more of an issue with that grazing product than it is in a stored situation. The other thing is if we have high nitrogen fertilizer, that tends to increase the risk of prussic acid as well. So a few concerns that make sorghums a great product, but with a certain level of risk involved. Because of that risk with prussic acid, we've seen a lot more interest in the millet family, which again is a warm season annual grass, but does not have that risk of prussic acid. So we've seen some more interest in there. Again, there are several families of millets, and I've kind of grouped those together, and I'll share some of those. So the first family we want to talk about is the Foxtail Millet family. So you might hear it called German or Hungarian or Siberian millet, also different names of the subspecies in this family. Again, because it's warm season, we look at planting mid-May to early April. It works well in a grazing situation, in a green chop, and of all of the warm season annuals, this is probably the best option if we want to look at a dry hay opportunity. It is a one-cut crop, so we're going to let it grow and just take one harvest off of it, but can produce somewhere in that 2 to 4 tons per acre off of that single crop. Again, no prussic acid, but we do want to point out, and especially this picture of that seed head, you can see it is related to the foxtail families. And so we want to try to harvest it or prevent it, I guess, from reseeding itself if we're putting it into our crop ground acres. The second family is the Japanese millets. And again, planting the same time, the benefit to the Japanese millet is that it's a multiple cut crop. So we can go in and take probably 2, maybe 3 cuttings off of it in a year, yielding somewhere in that 2 to 5 tons per acre. Again, it works well from a grazing and green chop silage standpoint. It probably is too coarse to put up for dried hay. Again, that stem's just a little too coarse, a little too big to really dry down well in most of our Iowa summers. It will tolerate some cool, wet summers. Most of our warm season annuals like a hot, dry summer. This one will tolerate cool and wet. So if you have the ability to predict summer weather and it predicts as cool and wet, this might be your best option. However, and especially again, if you look at the seed head, this is in the barnyard grass family. So we want to make sure we do the best job we can to prevent that from reseeding year to year. Our third millet family then is the hybrid pearl millet, or sometimes called the cattail millet. And if you can see in the picture down here, the seed head on this millet looks kind of like a cattail. Again, plant mid-May to early June. It's a warm season, have grazable forage in about 50 days. Again, it's a multiple cut crop, so we can go in and graze it a couple times a year or harvest it 2 to 3, yielding that 2 to 5 acres. Again, works well to graze, green chop, or silage, but it is not recommended for hay. This is the coarser of the millet family. So again, just too coarse and too big of a stem to really dry down well. The one thing about pearl millet is it likes it hot and dry. It does not like cool, wet summers. So where the Japanese millet would tolerate cool summers, the hybrid pearl does not. It wants it hot and dry. The last warm season I want to mention is teff grass, and it's not really it's not in the sorghum family and it's not in the millet family, but it is a very a grass that has a lot of opportunities with it. It's warm season, so again, it likes to be planted in May and June. Seeding rate, as you can see, 4 to 5 pounds per acre, very small seed, planted at a depth of 1/8 to 1/4 of an inch. So one of the comments I've heard from producers who tried teff grass is that it's hard to get established. And part of it is probably we get the seed too deep. So if you do decide to try to use teff grass and put that into your rotation, seed bed preparation is really, really, really critical with teff grass. Yield somewhere in that 2.5 to 5.5 tons an acre, similar to our millets. You will definitely benefit from nitrogen added to this crop here. Again, we have forage ready in 50 days or so, multiple cuttings. So we can get some regrowth and a couple cuttings off of this in a year's time. So it makes excellent hay. It's a very nice soft leafed grass to make hay with. The key is getting it established well. And then just want to mention a few things. What I've talked about now are individual species. What we've got here is we have some interest in that multiple species blend. And so one of the options that we hear some folks talk about trying is the sorghums and soybeans in some kind of a mixture. Basically, the soybeans will add a little bit in terms of protein to that blend. Probably works better with the Sedan grass than the tall forage sorghum because of the multiple harvest there. Doesn't add a lot of tonnage, but does add a little bit to it. Again, improves the feed quality. The other thing we hear some folks talking about is adding a Brassica into our grass mixtures. So things like the forage rape and kale, turnips, radish, those are our Brassicas. They probably are best designed to be used in those cool season mixes, but we do have a few warm seasons that will throw it in. Probably partners a little better with the millet families than it would in the sorghum Sedan grass family, simply because of growth type and height and so forth. So is an option. Don't see it used a whole lot, maybe more in a grazing situation than in a harvesting situation. Kind of the bottom line then is what's it cost and is it worthwhile doing? Can we afford it? So I took the oat budget from the ISU Ag Decision Maker and tried to put in Sedan grass is what I used, assuming 4 tons per acre chopped and bagged. So I'm looking at chopping this rather than grazing. And I have entered in here some custom rates, just use the custom rate for seed and fertilizer. I use custom rates so I don't have to put labor in. I put in 25 pounds of seed and some nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium fertilizer. Put in a land charge of $150 an acre. Granted, that might be low for a lot of areas, but assuming we're going to use our rougher ground closer to our pastures if we're going to go into a rotation like this. Looking then to chop, haul, and bag that silage. What I come down to is a cost of about $369 an acre to put this in. If we've got 4 tons of forage at $100 hay equivalent, we're looking at a return of about $30 overall cost to go into this forage system, provided then that we have the ability to utilize that $100 forage cost in our own cattle operation. So it's not a high profit item compared to corn soy rotation, but it definitely is in the black, although I have it red here, but it's in the black and is a definite opportunity to look at. Again, just as I look back at the summer annuals, the risks I think are involved with that. Part of the challenge is planning for what fields work well into this rotation, that we can break up our corn soybean rotation, put it into forage grazing for a year, go back into corn soybeans. Establishment is critical. And as we go back and you remember what I said about species selection is, can we establish it with our typical working equipment? And then finally, when it comes to grazing management, just need to put a plug in there. Warm season grasses should not be grazed as short as cool season grasses. So our residue height at the time we pull off of these warm season annual grasses should probably be in that 8 to 10 inch range, maybe up to a foot, to make sure we have enough adequate stem there to restart the plants for the next year. Finally, the key with warm season annuals is we can't do things the way we've always done them. We need to think about how do we manage them a little bit differently in order to be able to optimize warm season annuals in our rotation. With that, I've looked at species. I'm going to turn the program over to Erica now, and she's going to talk about some of the research that we've been doing here at Iowa State on annual forages. Erica.
All right, so like Denise mentioned, we have been doing some annual forage plot research at some of our outlying farms. So we want to talk a little bit about how things are going when we're incorporating annuals, both cool season and warm season, into our crop rotations, specifically for a forage resource. So to start with, we've kicked off the project utilizing 5 different species of Coolseasons. Denise mentioned this too, but we've done another segment on the Crops TV that's specific to Coolseasons. So if you have more questions about those, make sure you go check them out too. But real quick, I just want to highlight some of the why we chose these species that we have. So cereal rye, basically it's been kind of that gold standard for cover crops for Coolseasons. And so we've got a lot of questions from producers about, should it really be the species that we're after when we're targeting forage production? So barley is a pretty uncommon one. And this is something that we had been hearing questions from producers about if it would overwinter. So typically barley would be planted in the spring, taken as a resource sometime early to late spring, and then still come in behind with the cash crop behind it. So that was something we want to try just to see how it would overwinter and what the quality looks like here in Iowa. We had a third species that would be our typical hard red winter wheat. So this would probably be, if you planted wheat before, this is probably what it would look like. So obviously it has a little bit of an advantage over cereal rye just because it's a little bit later maturing. There's been some more recent hybrids of wheat that allows for a forage variety. And basically this is just delaying maturity of that wheat even further. So it's a little bit higher quality, more palatable to livestock from that perspective. And then our fifth tree species was triticale, which would just be that hybrid of the cereal rye and the wheat. And basically it's just kind of the best of both worlds. So still as hardy as cereal rye, but a little bit delayed in maturity compared to wheat. And a big component we also wanted to add with this study was our application of a nitrogen fertilizer, just to show what that response looks like when we're really targeting yield production with our Coolseasons. So on our next slide here, we have a map of our outlying farms where we're doing this research. So the research that I'm showing today is specific to 3 farms in southern Iowa, but we have kind of expanded this project to a research farm in northeast Iowa as well at the Nashua Research Farm for Iowa State. The data from today is just from these 3 southern Iowa farms. So Denise showed something pretty similar to this earlier as well. And so this is just kind of demonstrating what our timeline is for this. So basically what we're doing now is looking at planting these Coolseasons in the fall and then coming in the spring in that April-May timeframe to harvest those Coolseasons and see what our yield and quality looks like. Then we're coming in behind that and planting those warm seasons in that late May, early June timeframe, and then hopefully taking 2 to 3 cuttings of that warm season throughout that summer growing period. This is a picture taken from our Armstrong Research Farm this spring, just right before we had harvested these Coolseasons. And really what I wanted to show here was just kind of some of the variation that we visually see. So as we've applied some of these treatments over top of the picture here, you can see some of those that have our plus nitrogen or that 50 pounds of nitrogen treatment applied. They're a little bit darker green in color. You can see some variation in the height there as well. So some of that's driven by our maturity, while others of it is just strictly based on whatever that species is. So I'd like to point out here in the back, you can see our barley treatments. Those plots are pretty empty and just did not have very good luck getting our barley to grow. This picture here is just looking at some individual plants that we had pulled from the plots this day and laid them out together just to get a visual of our difference in our height. So you can see there just based on the height of our cereal rye, our 2 wheat varieties, and the triticale, they were all pretty comparable. And we're just over, I think they were in that 12 to 14 inches was the height that what they would have had. And then you can see our little barley plant down there too. Obviously had a harder time with the winters here in Iowa. This table is looking at what our yields would look like. And so typical for our Coolseasons, for sample them in late May, if they're right in that ballpark of 1 ton of dry matter per acre to 2 tons of dry matter per acre. But really what I want to point out here across these species is that boost that we saw when we did apply that nitrogen. So this nitrogen would have applied in the spring as we started to see those forages green up. And obviously we see a nice response there just from the increase in that yield that we saw when we applied that nitrogen. This table here is looking at the nutrient quality. So if you've seen in the pictures before, obviously this cover crops, they were still pretty immature, hadn't quite reached that reproductive stage yet. So as a whole, we see these are pretty high in quality. So our crude protein values are above what beef cow requirements would be. We see our fiber values there as well are a little bit lower than what we would typically see, but our TDN or our energy values there are really high. The bottom line here is an analysis of Iowa Coolseason pasture in this time frame as well. So typically we'd go to cover crops before grazing to give our pastures a little bit of a break, a rest recovery before we send them to pastures as well. So as you can see, these cover crops are a little bit higher than our vegetative pastures, even when sampled at this stage in the year. So behind our cool seasons, we've came in with 5 different species of our warm seasons. And so Denise has talked about all of these in detail prior, so I won't spend much time, but I do have a couple points I want to make here as well. So we used a brown midrib BMR variety of our sorghum Sedan Grass. And basically that is just a decrease in the lignin content of that plant, so it's more digestible to those animals. We use the 2 pearl millets just because those are popular in our beef cattle enterprises just from the grazing component because we don't have that prussic acid risk. Teff is something that we've seen an increase in from producers just because it does offer some of that high tonnage that Denise talked about. And it's a little bit more of an option to do for haying than some of those other species. So that's been an interest from producers just because it might be something that we can use a little bit farther away, or we might not have fences or capabilities to physically graze, but we can still get some of those benefits of a hay crop there. And then our 5th species is crabgrass. And usually when producers hear us talk about crabgrass, they tend to kind of laugh at us and roll their eyes maybe a little bit. But crabgrass has some benefits too, and it's really drought tolerant. So that was something that is of value. So especially this year, we had drought conditions in southern Iowa, and our crabgrass did fairly well compared to some of our other species. So Japanese millet, Denise mentioned earlier that it likes wet conditions. And basically when we took our second cutting, there was no more growth from our first cutting with that Japanese millet. So definitely not very drought tolerable from that standpoint. And then again, with this plots, our warm seasons, we added that nitrogen component as well. Again, this is just a visual of our plots, looking at some of the differences we might see. So if you're not familiar with these species, you can see there's quite a bit of variation in height here. And that would just be because of those species. So typically our sorghum Sedan grasses are much taller, where we would see our millets that are here obviously are a lot finer stem, shorter in varieties, and more leaf area that's present. Again, you can see some of those differences in the color just based on that nitrogen application, with those that have had nitrogen are darker in color. So this is a table looking at our McNay Research Farm yield specifically, just one of the farms versus the other table on the cool seasons had all 3. And so with this year, you can look down there when in 19, with this data, our warm seasons were not planted until July 1st. So a little bit later than what we would like to see done ideally. And then also too, these were only sampled once throughout the growing season versus, we'd like to see at least 2 times. But in general here, you can still see the tonnage that we were getting. So again, this was just one cutting, a little bit longer than what we would like to see of that period from planting to actually being sampled or harvested, just because of the year and our management there. But again, we're somewhere in that 1.5 to 2 tons of our dry matter. We see that nice nitrogen response. And typically we would see a lot of these species, we would expect to be between 2 and 4 tons of dry matter. This table again is just showing those forage quality of these different samples that we have. So you can see this, there's a lot more variety variation in what our analysis looks like than some of those cool seasons. Again, the crude protein levels are fairly high compared to what those might be. So the crabgrass down there is quite a bit higher than everything else. And crabgrass is really a late maturing plant. So we would expect that it would be a little bit higher in that protein just because it stays vegetative longer than some of these other species. Our fiber values are listed here in that ADF and NDF columns. And those are kind of lower than what we would typically see for our pastures during this time frame. So again, our pastures are predominantly cool season based. And during this time frame where we're sampling these warm seasons, our pastures are pretty much dormant, burn up, and there's not a whole lot of feed selection there for our cattle. So this is a good alternative to integrate some of these warm seasons into the grazing. So 2020 was year 2 of a 4-year project looking at this. So obviously we're only about halfway through collecting this data, and it's been a learning curve for us as well. Another component that we have not talked about, but our agronomists are working on, is looking at our soil nutrient loss when we're removing those forages mechanically. And so this scenario, we're doing a lot of small plot research so we can do more intense sampling, but our intent is to utilize this project as a producer would on farm, more specifically for grazing or coming in and harvesting it as silage. But our agronomists are interested in looking at how much nutrients are we pulling from that soil when we're removing those forages. And then, of course, a big part of this project is really focused on that producer education and demonstrations of incorporating those annuals into their rotations. So this project was basically built upon questions and concerns, interests that we were hearing from producers out in the field. And so we really want to make sure that we're sharing that information back to those producers. Just real quick, we want to say thank you to our collaborators and our funders of the project. So we have several beef and agronomy team with extension that are on the project. So you can see the names listed there. Of course, a lot of this research has been done at our outlying research farms throughout the state of Iowa. So we are very thankful for them often doing the heavy lifting on the sampling components. And then, of course, too, we have several project funders and our supporters, too, who have funded the projects and also, too, donated some seed to these projects as well. So this is a little bit of the research that we have been doing. I'm going to turn it back over to Denise to talk about implementing those forages.
Okay, so just a quick review, some of those best management practices for utilizing annual forages in your rotation. Establishment is critical. It's important for all crops, but it's really critical with these forages to make sure we have a good seed bed and we get those seeds planted at the appropriate depth. If we're looking at trying to graze this and wanting to keep it vegetative, keeping our plants vegetative, we may look at a staggered planting date depending on how many fields we have to work with or sections of that field. So if we're looking at trying to get more grazing through a certain field, we may want to plant that in 2 splits, maybe a week or 2 apart between each one. Obviously, from a grazing standpoint, if we can strip graze these summer annuals, we're going to have much better utilization, much less loss. Again, because we have a large quantity of forage out there, we have the potential for increased waste. Remembering also that our minimum stubble height that at the time we remove our cattle from these warm season grasses should be 6 to 8 inches at least, depending on the species, because they are going to take a little more plant to get good regrowth. With all of our warm seasons, corn included, nitrate toxicity can become a risk, especially in drought conditions with high nitrogen fertilizer. It's a small risk, but it is something we do need to mention from an animal standpoint. And then finally, remembering if we're dealing with sorghums and Sedan varieties, we need to be aware of prussic acid. Make sure that those plants are 18, I always like to say 2 to 2.5 feet tall before we graze it. Sorghums or Sedan grass can be a little shorter than the sorghums, but just a good rule of thumb, a couple feet tall. and then avoiding grazing for a couple weeks after an injury like frost or hail or grazing. Make sure we give it a good 2 weeks after a killing frost before we go back out to graze to make sure that prussic acid has dissipated. Just another way of looking at the economics. I showed you one set on Sedan Grass earlier. Just another way to look at it. If we're looking at somewhere around $45 an acre for seed, the custom rate of $18 to drill, and some fertilizer, somewhere in the $100 range an acre. That's a little less than what I showed you earlier. Also does not have a rental charge in it. So you can see that doesn't have the custom harvesting charge as well if we're looking at grazing these warm seasons. If we're getting somewhere in that 5 ton per acre yield off of it, that means we can graze about 222 cow days per acre. So our $103 per acre divided by the 222 cow days gives us about 46 cents per cow per day grazing cost. So very, very inexpensive from a grazing standpoint to be able to utilize these warm season annuals. Finally, we want to point everyone to our Iowa Beef Center website. We've tried to put all of our annual crops mostly in the cover crop section, and that's under our forage and hay section. So iowabeefcenter.org and then forage and cover crops. And with that, I'd like to say thanks to our ISU agronomy team and the Crops TV team for giving us the opportunity to visit with you. As Erica mentioned, we'll be having more field days using annuals across the state as we go forward in the next few years. And so we would like to encourage you to give it a try, give one of us a call, and we'd be glad to help you get started trying to implement some annual forages into your crop rotation. Thank you.